Hi everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a review of the new Death Grips album, Government Plates. Death Grips is an experimental hip-hop trio, and you might already be familiar with their very noisy, aggressive, chaotic, and cutting-edge fusion of rap, electronic music, and industrial music. And you might already be familiar with just how prolific they are as a band as well, since they put out their first major full-length project, Ex-Military. They ended up dropping 2 full-length albums the following year, one of which was my favorite of 2012.
Funny Money Stores, good album. Good.
And the other was the root of one of the year's biggest musical controversies, with Death Grips releasing it onto the internet for stream and for download completely for free to their fans against their label's wishes at the time, Epic Records, who dropped them shortly after.
Scroll labels. They don't know what they're doing.
And earlier this year, the band made the announcement that they would be dropping their next full-length LP in 2014. However, just this past week, suddenly, out of the blue, no warning whatsoever, they decided to put out their latest full-length LP that I assume they had been working on all of this time and maybe plan to drop next year, Government Plates. However, after giving this new release of Death Grips multiple listens, I'm not really feeling much more than a light 6 on it. I was pretty impressed with what this LP was doing or trying to do with the first several tracks here. The opening song on this thing featuring some broken glass, very shrill synths enter the picture, and Ride vocally gives one of his most intense performances on any Death Grips track ever. The chilling screams at the start of this track are fantastic, as well as the very speedy, demonic passages of vitriol that are also spat throughout this thing. Not only that, but this track feels like one of the least hip-hop oriented songs that Death Grips has ever done. The groove on this thing, as well as the very heavy, fuzzed out bass riffs, this song, more than anything, sounds like a lightning bolt, or at least a Black Pus track. I would even compare some of these bass riffs to a dubstep drop, and I realize there are a lot of people out there that make that comparison to Death Grips in a negative way. However, I find fusions like this very interesting, and I think it's great with tracks like this that Death Grips is sort of on the cusp of some new and interesting sounds still. The second track on here, and BONNY, has some squelching synth arpeggios that I think are fantastic. The tone of these synths isn't too unlike a lot of moments from No Love Deep Web, and when the very loud, bassy, crunchy, distorted bass kicks enter the picture after a pretty toned down intro on this thing, the song just goes into hyperdrive, and it is super aggressive. And vocally, Ride just gets crazier and crazier and crazier as the song progresses. Another favorite of mine on here, To Heavens, which is a song that I think features one of the most unique beats Death Grips has ever worked on. Zach Hill's drums are not only very punchy and hard-hitting on this track, but I love the sampled metallic tones that are placed throughout this song, especially as it gets going into the verses. It's really panoramic, it's dizzying, it's kind of psychedelic. And there are also some pitch-shifted samples of MC Ride's vocals placed throughout this track too. Now, sampling Ride's vocals and reusing them on a track or placing them in different spots of a track, nothing new for Death Grips, but I do think it is kind of the downfall of a handful of songs on here. Instead of some fresh verses after every chorus or a vocal performance that changes and evolves as the song progresses, we get a league of tracks on here that don't really feature much vocal input. And some of these tracks are pretty short too. I can really only call them beats since there's not just a unique vocal performance on the track. We're just kind of getting a sample and it's being played throughout. And while I don't really mind a beat or an instrumental from anyone or even Death Grips in theory, a lot of these songs are incredibly underwhelming and just kind of leave me feeling like I'm listening to Death Grips with all of the ferocity and all of the noise, but none of the coherence. Like the song This Is Now, which is incredibly chaotic, electronic, probably the best of all of these instrumental type tracks, merely because of how interestingly the percussion is treated on this thing with these phaser drums, which feel like they're just bouncing and echoing and creating some really psychedelic textures. The layers of rhythms and grooves on this track, absolutely insane, even if the last minute of this song just kind of feels like a copy and paste job of everything that happened before. And the song Overflow, another track on here that I like, killer freaking bass drop on this thing, total highlight of this entire album. But again, I feel like the second half is just another copy and paste job here of whatever is going on in the first half. Redundancy keeps a lot of these songs from feeling like songs and instead just leaves them feeling like song ideas, especially on tracks where that redundancy, that repetition gets incessant. Tracks like Feels Like a Wheel and Bootleg, songs that I literally cannot stand because of how stale the songs get even 30 seconds in. And while these instrumental tracks do bring some newer sounds into the fold for Death Grips, there are some songs here that just feel like they have no surprise to them whatsoever, like the title track on here, which just feels like a remix of the No Love Deep Web song Black Dice, a very uninteresting remix. And the song Big House, I like the speedy synth arpeggios and the very quiet, toned down, eerie beats and verses on the second half of this track too, but again, it's another moment where it cuts out and it feels like it could have been an interesting Death Grip song, but it's just too short of breath to leave a long-lasting impact. And then the final song on here, while it is maybe the most ambitious with its length, it suffers from the same incessant repetitions that make so many other tracks on here just blatantly uninteresting. Overall, I gotta say Death Grips on this LP, still very aggressive, very original, and very attention-grabbing with some very good songs, great songs for them on the front end. However, once this album grabs your attention, it does very, very, very little to maintain it for the duration of its very short length. On this thing, half-baked song ideas, uselessly repetitive song structures, shorter track lengths, less of a focus on lyrics, less of a focus on memorability. Death Grips has come through with a record that has much less impact than The Money Store, Ex-Military, and No Love Deep Web. Transition. But if you've given this LP a listen, what did you think of it? Did you love it? Hate it? Why? What do you think I should review next? And that's it. Death Grips, government plates, forever.